So our keynote today, Jordan Abel, welcome. Jordan is a Nisga'a writer from Vancouver. He's the author of The Place of Scraps, winner of the Dorothy Livesday Poetry Prize, Uninhabited and Injun, winner of the Griffin Poetry Prize. Abel's latest project, Nisga'a, forthcoming from McClellan and Stewart in 2020, is a deeply personal and autobiographical book that attempts to address the complications of contemporary Indigenous existence and the often invisible intergenerational impact of residential schools. Abel's recently completed PhD at Simon Fraser University, congratulations, has recently completed a PhD, so I read that one. And he is currently working as an assistant professor in the Department of English and Film Studies at the University of Alberta, where he teaches Indigenous literature and creative writing. So join me in welcoming Jordan.
Thank you. Sure. Hey, thank you so much for being here, and Tanya, thank you for inviting me. It's such a pleasure. I'm here to share with you some of my latest work. So the paper, I'm just reading parts of my book to you. But there's the first half is from an earlier part of the book, and the second half is from the last, like the very last part of the book. So hello. That's the first thing it says on my paper. My name is Jordan. I'm a Nisga'a writer from Vancouver, and I'm currently living in Edmonton, Alberta, and am an uninvited guest on Treaty 6 territory. I wanted to start off with this self-identification from my nation, because for many Indigenous peoples, these kinds of national identifications can indicate one's home, one's friends and family, and one's position within indigeneity. Likewise, these kinds of national identifications can also be an indicator of which community or communities we are accountable to. For example, Layli Long Soldier identifies as a citizen of the Oglala Lakota Nation. Louise Erdrich identifies as being both Chippewa and of German-American descent. Craig Womack identifies as being Muskogee Creek and Cherokee. Robert Warrior identifies as being Osage. However, I should say that these kinds of national identifications do not always adequately account for the complexity and plurality of Indigenous existence. For some Indigenous peoples, they simply do not tell the whole story. For example, when I say that I am Nisga'a, you might assume that I grew up in Kincolith, BC, like my grandparents. You might assume that when I say that I am Nisga'a, that I speak Nisga'a. You might assume that my writing reflects on Nisga'a knowledge, Nisga'a worldviews, and Nisga'a understandings. Then again, you might not assume any of those things. A few years ago, during the City of Vancouver's Year of Reconciliation events, I was at a dinner meeting at a restaurant on Water Street in downtown Vancouver. I was one of several poets that was commissioned to write a poem in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for an initiative that was called Reconciliation Through Poetry, that was sponsored by Simon Fraser University's Center for Dialogue. That the work that the poets were engaging with was meant to honor the work of Chief Robert Joseph. At the dinner meeting, the poets, along with a few administrators, talked with Chief Robert Joseph, exchanged stories, and discussed what reconciliation meant for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. After a while, Chief Joseph directed his attention to me and asked me where I was from. I told him that I was Nisga'a and that my grandparents were from Keynote. After a few moments, he said, "You're not really Nisga'a. Some of my friends are Nisga'a. Do you know how I can tell? If you were really Nisga'a, you would have said Nisga'a with a K sound. You said Nishga with an SH sound." You know, I didn't really know how to respond to that. My grandparents are Nisga'a, my dad is Nisga'a, but to a certain extent, he was right. I wasn't born in Kincolith. I was born in Vancouver, moved when I was very young, and essentially grew up in Ontario. Does that make me less Nisga'a? And what does it mean to be Nisga'a with a K sound? What does it mean to be Nishga with an SH sound? What does it mean to be Nisga'a but to have grown up removed from the Nisga'a territory? What does it mean to be Indigenous if your relationship to community has become severed somehow? What does it mean to be both an intergenerational survivor of residential schools and an urban Indigenous person? I think these are the questions that I've been struggling with my whole life. I want to tell you about my life for the purposes of truth and openness and accountability and transparency. I think especially now when there have been so many thoughts and questions about how we define indigeneity and who or who does not count as Indigenous. I'm telling you about my life because I am accountable not only to the Nisga'a community, but I'm also accountable to the communities of intergenerational survivors of residential schools and the communities of urban Indigenous peoples. I am accountable to the communities of dispossessed Indigenous peoples who are not able to find their way back to their communities because of an ongoing legacy of colonial violence. I am accountable to myself, and I hope to talk openly about my subject position within the scope of indigeneity. Colonialism has had and continues to have a profound impact on Indigenous peoples. And some of that legacy of violence has been discussed at length, and some of that legacy of violence remains silenced. Here's a scene from my life. I'm 22 years old. It's 2007. I am an undergraduate at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. I'm studying English. According to my official transcripts, I have taken a whole bunch of things, but at this point in my academic career, I have not studied one book by an Indigenous author, nor have they been assigned in any of my classes. In fact, at this point in my life, I've never even met another Nisga'a person. The Nisga'a people are from northern coastal BC. At least that's what I hear. That's what I've read. That's what I've been told. But I've never been there. I've never had an opportunity to get there. So here I am, a young Nisga'a person who has not only never met another Nisga'a person in his entire life, but is also painfully, and I mean really hurtfully, deep down pain in your heart kind of hurting, aware of the hole in his life where Nisga'a knowledge and Nisga'a understanding belong. At this point, I think the only book I'd ever read by an Indigenous person was Green Grass, Running Water by Thomas King, and that was at least somewhat by accident. I didn't read it because it was written by an Indigenous author. I read it because someone had casually mentioned that it was good. And it was good. And sometime after I'd read that book, I asked myself why I didn't know anything about the Niska people, why I didn't know anything about myself, why didn't I know my language, why didn't I know my culture, why is it that I grew up in Ontario but was born in BC, why have I spent all my life not knowing the Indigenous side of my family? So being at least a somewhat dutiful student at the time, my first instinct was to go to the library. So I went to the library and searched for books using the search term Niska. And one of the first books I found was this book, Totem Poles by Marius Barbeau. You know, I don't honestly know what I expected this book to be, but when I opened it up, there were stories about the Niska people. There was some hints of Niska knowledge. I didn't articulate it in this way when I was going through this process, but what I was looking for was a doorway into Niska knowledge and nationalism. And without knowing any Niska people, or I think more importantly, without understanding why I didn't know any Niska people, Barbeau's work was in fact a doorway, even if it ultimately turned out to be a deeply distorted colonial representation of Niska knowledge and Niska worldviews. Totem Poles was an imperfect entry point, and I had no other way in. And Barbeau's book was filled with photographs of totem poles and stories from Indigenous peoples from the Pacific Northwest. But instead of providing me a pathway to Indigenous knowledge, Barbeau's work opened up another doorway. I began to wonder why I didn't know any of these stories, why I didn't know any of the Niska people in my family. In my book, The Place of Scraps, the main narrative revolves around the role Marius Barbeau played in dismantling Niska culture, along with many other nations in the Pacific Northwest, by the buying and often stealing of totem poles and other cultural items from struggling communities. In the narrative of The Place of Scraps, it also becomes clear that Barbeau essentially stole a totem pole from the community that my grandparents were born in. And there's a narrative thread in which I remember encountering this pole in the Royal Ontario Museum when I was a child without knowing or understanding its significance in my life. That, more or less, is the narrative of The Place of Scraps. But when people have talked about why precisely I use erasure in this book, I think most people end up missing out on a key detail. There's suggestion that my erasing of Barbeau's words in some way replicates Barbeau's own attempted erasure of Indigenous peoples is absolutely part of it. That by removing totem poles and taking advantage of struggling communities, Barbeau was actively contributing to colonial erasures. I think that's true, but the detail that's missing, the reason why Barbeau's text was so important to this work is also because Barbeau's writing was the first imperfect glimpse I had into Niska culture, and that The Place of Scraps, in addition to being about Marius Barbeau and salvage anthropology, is also about what it means to be an intergenerational survivor of residential schools. It's about what those experiences can look like, and it's about having no choice but to learn about my own family history through the now debunked work of a dead white anthropologist. Here I think is a good moment to pause for a second and to talk about Indigenous identity and position, because it's helpful, I think, to frame urban Indigenous experiences and experiences of intergenerational trauma through these frameworks, and to subsequently understand these lived experiences as not only being manifestations of Indigenous identity and position, but also being deeply misunderstood and underappreciated categories of Indigenous identity Um, you don't have to read this whole thing. I'll read the necessary parts of it. As Belinda Lawrence talks about in her book, Real Indians and Others, Indigenous identity can be thought of as a highly negotiated, or as a negotiated and highly contested set of realities. The way I've been thinking through Indigenous identity then is quite similar to Belinda Lawrence's thinking. Indigenous identity can be thought of not so much as being fixed or static, but instead as being fluid, shifting, relational, multifaceted, and at times ambiguous. In Deanna Redder's introduction to Learn, Teach, Challenge, she privileges the term position over the term identity as one that undermines the object-subject dichotomy and makes visible the lines of relationship that affect one's perspective. Redder's suggestion here to think through position rather than identity has been really useful for me, and I think importantly shifts conversations about identity away from the problematic discourse of authenticity. My purpose in this talk is to address my positionhood as both an urban Indigenous person and an intergenerational survivor of residential schools. And before I move on to this next part, I just want to preface this section by saying that I'm about to share these details with you, not particularly because I like to share these things. In fact, some of these details are still quite painful for me. But I feel the need to share them with you in this context because I think it is important to understand what the experiences of an intergenerational survivor of residential schools can look like and where the difficulties are with communicating this type of lived experience to both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples who may or may not have any idea of what these lived experiences might look like. This is my dad. His name is Lawrence Wilson. I have met this man exactly once in my life, when I was 23. He's the first Niska person I've ever met. He's a carver and a painter, and he carved this mask that he's currently wearing, and this mask. He lived in Vancouver for most of his life, and mostly worked as an artist. Here's a photo of him painting this frog. And this painting is currently hanging on my wall in Edmonton. Here's the finished painting. Here's my mom and my dad. Catherine Abel on the left, Lawrence Wilson on the right. They met sometime in the early 1980s, and I was born on April 13th, 1985. In an affidavit from the Provincial Court of British Columbia between my mother and my father, dated May 8th, 1996, the fourth line reads as follows. On June 15th, 1987, Miss Abel was advised by Detective Michael Miller of the Vancouver Police Department that Mr. Wilson was under investigation for a possible sexual assault against a 15-year-old girl. Line 5. On June 16, 1987, Miss Abel was advised that Mr. Wilson had, in fact, been charged with a sexual offense against a 15-year-old girl. Thereafter, nothing was heard from Mr. Wilson. He neither exercised his access pursuant to the terms of the order of May 21st, 1987, nor contacted Miss Abel in any way. Line 6. In the fall of 1987, Miss Abel confirmed her instructions to us to continue to act as her agent, as she no longer resided in the province of British Columbia. Her instructions were that we should notify Miss Abel of any inquiries from Mr. Wilson or attempt to contact her so that she could make appropriate arrangements for the exercise of the access to which Mr. Wilson was entitled by court order. Line 7. Miss Abel provided our office with her forwarding address following her departure from the province of British Columbia. Line 8. We have received no inquiries from Mr. Wilson or anyone acting on his behalf with respect to the matter of the access to the child, Jordan Skye Wilson Abel, born April 13, 1985, since the date of our appearance in court on her behalf on May 21, 1987. Line 9. At the time of Mr. Wilson's disappearance in June of 1987, to the best of my knowledge and belief, Mr. Wilson has been in receipt of income assistance benefits for a period of some years and was not in a position to provide support. That fact, combined with his disappearance, resulted in our recommendation to Miss Abel not to pursue Mr. Wilson for child support, given that she continues to have no knowledge of his whereabouts or financial circumstances. The likelihood of any family support from Mr. Wilson is too remote to justify the costs associated with pursuing such an action. The affidavit summarizes my mother's departure from BC, the sexual abuse committed by my father, and his subsequent disappearance. But what the affidavit does not cover is that Lawrence Wilson, shortly after becoming a father, was also emotionally and physically abusive. In a letter that my mother wrote to me around 2008, she says that when she was 7 or 8 months pregnant, Lawrence revealed to her that his father and my grandfather had been violent to his mother, my grandmother, that he had, in quotes, broke her leg, knocked out her teeth, etc. End quotes. Later, she writes that not too long after Jordan came home from the hospital, that Lawrence's behavior changed. She notes that Lawrence became pathologically jealous and that he began to take his anger out physically on objects, threw a chair and broke it, crashed the baby's drying rack over the empty crib, and then clubbed her over the head while she was breastfeeding. Later, she writes that she finally got up the nerve to suggest that they weren't working out and should live separately. Lawrence apparently took such great offense to this that he knocked her on the floor and smashed a large clay ashtray over her head. According to the letter, he took off on his bicycle right after that. Here, she notes that she departed immediately afterwards for Victoria, where her brother lived, and stayed there for 2 weeks to recover. My first memories are of Ontario. I lived with my mother. None of the Indigenous side of my family was around. She had told me that my father had disappeared and that there was no way to contact him. It turned out that was mostly true. I grew up not knowing and not understanding why I was completely disconnected from any Niska people. When I finally decided that I needed to figure it out, I was eventually able to track down my father and several of my aunts and uncles. But it was over the phone with my Aunt Bonnie that everything in my life started to make sense. Why some of the Indigenous side of my family didn't talk to each other, why I felt so isolated, why everything was so broken. My Aunt Bonnie told me quite plainly that both my grandparents were survivors of residential schools. In fact, they met each other in the same residential school, the Presbyterian Coquitlam Indian Residential School in Chilliwack, BC. She told me that the best she could describe it was that her parents, that my grandparents, had learned how to be parents from residential schools. That all of that sexual, physical, and emotional abuse they've been taught in residential schools formed the foundations for their approaches to parenting. And that when it was time for them to become parents themselves, they passed all of that abuse down to my father's generation. I think for the first time in my life, I understood why I didn't know any Miniska side of my family. I understood why my experience of indigeneity was primarily based around confusion, disconnection, and isolation. I began to understand that even though I never attended residential schools, that my life had been profoundly shaped by an intergenerational trajectory of violence, and that the violence perpetrated by those schools doesn't just stop after the schools were closed or after the apology was issued. My position as an urban Indigenous person growing up in the city without a connection to my home community, and as a person impacted by intergenerational trauma, is one of disconnection and lack. The reason why I ended up turning to Barbeau's book for Indigenous knowledge can, I think, be traced directly back to that legacy of violence created by the Indian residential schools policy. So, as I mentioned before, this whole work is kind of about the afterlife of residential schools and intergenerational trauma. And in the spirit of truth and transparency, I have to say that this work has been incredibly difficult. And I feel like I need to say this because this work has come at a cost to me personally. To be honest, I don't know how often I'll be able to return to this work, to talk about this work, or to engage with this work. But I'm here now in this moment, and I'd like to talk about one of the other many moments where this project got started, because there are multiple origins. A few years ago, I was in a graduate class on Métis literature at Simon Fraser University. This class was taught by Professor Sophie McCall. And we ended up spending a lot of time talking about this article by Chris Anderson called Métis, What's Your Excuse? On the optics and misrecognition of Métis in Canada. And in that article, Anderson asked this question, which is quite long, so I'll read it for you. What obligation do any of us, Métis included, owe dispossessed Indigenous individuals, and even communities, who forward claims using a Métis identity based not on a connection to Métis national roots, but because it seems like the only possible option? Whenever we imagine a fair response to look like, it must account for the fact that Métis refers to a nation with membership codes that deserve to be respected. We are not a soup kitchen for those disenfranchised by past and present Canadian Indian policy. And as such, although we should sympathize with those who bear the brunt of this particular form of dispossession, we cannot do so at the expense of eviscerating our identity. I think it would be an understatement to say that this quote sparked something for me. In fact, when I first read it, I had this overwhelming feeling of both frustration and despair, and it really pissed me off, and it took me a long time to understand why. It's not that I always disagree with what Chris Anderson says. There's some things that he says that I do agree with. And I think his work on Métis nationalism and Indigenous peoplehood is really interesting. The issue for me, and the thing that really frustrated me, was that this was just one more article in a long list of articles and books that seem to be completely uninterested in addressing disenfranchised and dispossessed Indigenous peoples. And on my part, I think it's completely unfair of me to ask for that from Anderson's writing. In fact, it's probably unfair of me to ask for that from any article about indigeneity that isn't specifically also about issues of dispossession and displacement. Likely too, I think you can make the argument that if I really wanted to read about those issues, I should have just sought them out and gone elsewhere. But I think it's also fair to say, though, that issues of Indigenous sovereignty and nationalism are everywhere. And while I now know where to find good writing about Indigenous dispossession, including some really wonderful collaborative work between Evelyn Peters and Chris Anderson, many of those sources weren't visible to me at that time. All I could see through the books I was reading, through the relationships I had, through the communities I had access to, was work that seemed to be disinterested in the very issues that I found to be the most compelling. So I just wanted to say that this was a catalyzing moment for me, and I think this project in its current formation really grew out of this moment. And I also wanted to say that I'm deeply grateful to Sophie for putting this article on her syllabus and for all of the formative conversations that we've had. I should also say that this project as a whole is now a book, and it's really meant to function, like any book would, in that you're really supposed to read all of it or none of it, I think. But the next part will just draw out like one particular thread from that book, and hopefully it makes sense out of context. And I totally get that you haven't read it yet, so I'm concentrating on some of the more visual sections. And I'd like to address what particular threads in the work that includes a short text of mine called Empty Spaces. So here is a moment from the book where Empty Spaces appears. It's the text part of it, and the shape is my father's artwork, and there's some photo stuff in there too. Here's another moment where Empty Spaces appears in the book. And here's another moment. These images look much sharper in the book itself, but for the PowerPoint, they're a little bit fuzzy. Here's another moment. And here's another moment. So, in order to talk about this part of the book, I need to read you part of the text, because as you can probably tell, it's very difficult to actually read what the words say in many of these images. So I'll read you a short excerpt of what Empty Spaces sounds like. A deep, narrow chasm, black rocks. The river lies still on those black rocks. A mile above, there is a tumbling. There is a moment. At this very moment, there is a tumbling in the air a mile above us that runs straight through the open heavens and into some other place. A deep hollow, no shape, no consistency, no breaking, some 100 feet in the air. Some places are softer than others, some 100 feet up in the air. Some right angles enter into narrow passageways, and some right angles break off a mile in the air above us. These rocks are full of cracks. Water has worked through some deep hollows, breaking here, wearing there, breaking and wearing until the chasm separates into two caverns. Some 100 feet in the air, there is no danger. There is scattered driftwood and the scent of roses. There are glimpses of roses and rocks and shrubs. There is a steep, rugged ascent, a path that winds among the black rocks and trees. Somewhere in the air there is a scent of roses. Somewhere out there is the wilderness. A reasonable distance through scenes of greenery and nature, and glimpses of mountain ranges that disappear just as suddenly as they appear. Among the rocks and trees there are mounds of earth and other rocks and other driftwood. Somewhere there is an islet and another islet and a clear sheet of water and bald rocks just beneath the surface. There are forests and straits and islets and rocks, and somewhere in the air is the scent of roses. There are crevices and fissures and rocks. The rocks surround themselves in other rocks, although there are sometimes mounds of earth in between. On the shore there are fragments of rocks. In the deeper parts of the river there is more tumbling. At this very moment the river pours into a wide fissure where it just becomes more water between rocks. Between the broken rocks and the deep roaring cavern there is a scent of roses and driftwood and trees. There is light and straight naked rocks and immovable trees. There are woods and rivers, and the bed of that river is ragged with rocks and intersecting ravines that cut silently across the water above, where somewhere in the air is the scent of roses. The woods are full of sounds and rocks and trees. The woods are full. The upper air, where it drifts over the tops of trees, is full of sounds. Just where it breaks over the tops of trees, there are slow intermingling drifts of sounds and scents that brush over the clearing some 50 or 60 feet up in the air. Rocks and logs and mounds of earth and narrow fissures and bottomland and little ponds and a brook that shoots through the narrow fissures, spreading through moment after moment of stretched light. There is a bellowing in the passageways between the rocks. There are moments of admonished madness. There are moments spreading over the acres of bottomland. There are precipices and adjacent lakes and headwaters. There is a fierceness here that flows through the waters. These rivers are full to the brim. These waters stream down to our feet. In 6 hours, these waters will rush in, and in another 6 hours, these waters will rush out. Salt grows in this water. The water in the woods and on the Great Lakes and in the higher parts of the sea, stretching out horizontally until the current flows upward like blood at the throat. On these waters, the edges touch the shores and the deer paths trace back to the streams. In the short distance in between the water and the black rocks is a deep shadow. The breath of the stream, the glancing waters, the throat of the river, these woods are full. Gliding above, somewhere up in the impenetrable darkness is the scent of roses. Somewhere there is the sound of the rushing waters ringing through the deep stillness of the night. The moon rises and the light glances here and there on the water and down to the riverbed. At times the light hangs in the air on the breath of the river. There are dark waters, there is night. This is the unmingled sweetness of air that sinks into the foaming waters. These are the vaults of forest. There is a stillness here somewhere in the wilderness. There is lightning and then there is stillness. There are echoes that rush through the forest until they disappear. A mile above there is a tumbling. In the foaming waters there is the color of blood gushed from some other place. Some other throat, some other softer place. Some waters carry the dead.
Somewhere up in the air there is the scent of roses. Some flames last forever. Some waters thicken with limbs and bodies and trembling voices. Some waters are still. Somewhere in the velocity of the uproar there is a current of air, an unmingled sweetness that sinks into the forest. The narrow path adjacent to the brook is full of bodies, the blood as natural as water. Glassy mirrors, the sunken hillsides, the shores, the black rocks between the mounds of earth, the glittering stars, the open air floating over the forest. In the valley, the stream overflows onto the banks. Here, the tumbling water washes bones, and the waters of the river go into the salt lake. There is a canopy from the woods spreading over the lake, shadowing a dark current with a deep hue. When the sun is setting, these waters become healing waters, but the sun is not setting, and the current branches silently into the dark parts of the lake. Somewhere in the forest, bark is peeled from a tree, branches break. For many minutes there is a struggle and a deep, cool wind. There is a current of air. There is silent motion, plunging and glancing and sweeping over the broken branches. The sound from the rushing waters drifts through the air. There are words and yells and cries as the air flows up from somewhere in the deep, narrow ravine. There is silence again, with the exception of the sound that comes from the rushing water. A few years ago, I started a conceptual project that was connected to James Fenimore Cooper's 1826 book, The Last of the Mohicans. I initially became interested in Cooper's work after reading Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. And in that book, Dunbar Ortiz argues that The Last of the Mohicans plays an important role in reinventing the colonial origins of the United States and in creating a narrative that was instrumental in nullifying guilt related to genocide. Dunbar Ortiz also argues that for the generations of young white men who read Cooper's work throughout the 19th century, The Last of the Mohicans became perceived fact, not fiction, and the basis for the coalescence of US American nationalism. And after attempting to work with the novel in a few different conceptual modes, and after failing to figure out how to make it work, I decided to do some additional reading. I wanted to know who was engaging with The Last of the Mohicans today and what they thought of it. So naturally, the first place I ended up was Goodreads. And it turns out there are a lot of people still reading The Last of the Mohicans, and many of them, at least on Goodreads, appear to be American high school students. And it also turns out that they really hate it. But they don't hate it for the same reasons that I do. Many of them appear to hate the book because they think James Fenimore Cooper is boring and they can't stand his seemingly endless descriptions of nature. So naturally, I pulled out as many descriptions of land and nature as I could from The Last of the Mohicans, and I started writing over them, I started writing through them, I started writing around them, and I started writing with them. And Empty Spaces, at least as it begins, is an impurely conceptual project that both animates and reanimates Cooper's representation of land as terra nullius, but also calls into question my relationships, plural, with the land. In Empty Spaces, the land is described in concrete details. There are hundreds of specific images that operate both individually and as pieces of a whole, but they are part of an impossible whole. The land here is ultimately a work of imagination, appropriation, and transformation. And as I reflect on this project, I often wonder what it means that I'm writing about imagining land, that my own relationship to Niska territory, as it's addressed in this book that you haven't read, is deeply fraught. Is it possible that my deepest connection to land comes through text, through imagination, through fiction? If I've learned anything from Indigenous nationalism, my relationship to the land should very obviously have been formed through a connection to the land itself, through family, through community, through Niska knowledge, Niska language, Niska worldviews. But how do those who have been dispossessed and severed from the land begin to think through what land means to them? Empty Spaces, then, is not so much about representing Cooper's vision of land as Terranelius, but instead it is about overwriting Terranelius. It is about imagining and reconstituting my relationship with the land. Much like many of my other projects, Empty Spaces is not so much about reinscribing Indigenous absence as it is about rearticulating Indigenous presence. So Empty Spaces is a project that's in part about these questions, but it is also a separate project. It's a project that has its own trajectory, which may or may not ever find a conclusion, and it is one of many currently unfinished examples of my artistic production. And I wanted to get to that moment so I could talk to you about why it appears in this book about residential schools and intergenerational trauma. There was a moment during the early stages of writing this book where it was important to me to put my work in dialogue with my dad's work. There was a moment where I wanted both of our artistic trajectories to speak to each other and to coexist together. Perhaps I was interested in creating these moments because there were no equivalent moments in our lives. Our works speak to each other even when we do not. The moments that are here on these pages are ultimately moments where both of our artistic outputs intertwine and bridge a seemingly insurmountable gap between us. Take for example, this moment that appears towards the end of the book. Here, my work occupies both the foreground and the background. The photo, which is literally shaped by my father's artwork, was taken last year in front of the Vancouver Art Gallery. The photo, for me, is in dialogue with another photo. That photo, which unfortunately is no longer available to me, featured my dad and I standing in front of these exact steps during the summer of 2008 on the occasion of our first and only meeting. The photo on this page, taken a decade later, contains neither of us, but the page as a whole contains both of us. Empty Spaces here is either the textured background that stands in contrast with the photo image of the frog, or it is the primary text of the page that has become partially eclipsed by that image. This moment for me is similar structurally to some of the symmetrical images that appear in the place of scraps, in that there is a distinct point of transition between two directions of reading. Here, that transition point is the space in between the work shaped by my father's art and my own personal work. In some ways, our work here bleeds together, and in other ways remains separate. I do wonder what it means for my work to exist in both the foreground and the background. I wonder what it means that I've gotten to know my father's art better than I've gotten to know my father. I wonder how much you can get to know someone through their art. I wonder what it means to be absent from this page. I wonder what it means to be present on this page. Before I wrote my first book, I had this feeling that my work was always going to end up going in this direction. I knew at some point that I would need to write something, even if it was just for me. But I also hoped that this moment would never arrive. There was a moment in the early stages of the writing process for this book where I felt like I could learn more about my father, learn more about my grandparents, learn more about my family and my culture and my language. But those things didn't happen in the same way that I originally imagined. I wish I had known my grandparents. There are so many things that I would like to tell them. There are so many things that I would hope they would tell me. But that is not possible. When I started writing this book, I did it just for me. I did it so I could hold up the pieces and see how they all connected together. I also wrote this book because I thought I could write my way home. I thought doing a project like this would bring me closer to something. Would bring me closer to knowing all the things that I don't know or that I can't know. It turns out that's not the case. I wish I had come to different conclusions, different realizations, but I didn't. I came to the same conclusions and realizations that are here on the pages of this book. I didn't find my way home. I didn't find my way anywhere but deeper. If there was a hole I was in, I just kept digging down. But now that I've come to the end of this project, my hope for this work is that someone else will read it and feel like they're not alone. My hope is that the things that I've written down here are helpful to someone. This story didn't turn out the way I had hoped. I wish I had different experiences that led to different places, and that I was standing here in this space with a feeling accomplishments and happiness and satisfaction. That is not the case. But I am standing here. I honestly can't imagine a world where that will ever be enough, but it is something.